Hello, I'm Arit, and welcome to my lightning talk, the open source plunge, practical strategies to start contributing. So a brief outline of what this talk is going to cover. I will summarize my journey into open source. I will talk about the benefits of open source participation, at least in my opinion. I will talk about how to identify well-maintained projects, and so you have the least amount of frustration getting started. And then I will end with a few tips for making your first pull requests. So I became a software engineer at 38. I'm a mom of two, and I'm bootcamp educated. And when bootcamp concluded, I really missed coding as part of a team. So my bootcamp, we had a cohort that started every week, and we were 10 engineers in my cohort. And so I felt very isolated after bootcamp wrapped up, and I decided to see if there was a way for me to continue coding with groups of people. And that's how I stumbled upon the website Code Triage. And Code Triage allows you to see different open source projects, and you can filter by language or framework. And I identified a few, but they were very difficult to get involved with for many reasons. Sometimes setting up the project locally was hard. I had so many errors. A lot of the project communities were not communicative. And so I would ask a question and it would take months to hear back. And it all felt very intimidating because I was brand new to coding. I had just graduated bootcamp. And so the Forem project, which is the company I work for now, and we are completely open source, was my first successful project that I got started getting involved into open source. The community was very responsive, and my first PR was welcomed like very enthusiastically. And so that did a lot to increase my confidence in participating in open source. Now, in my opinion, there are several benefits to open source participation, particularly for early career developers. I find that open source closely approximates a real world work experience. And for early career developers, we tend to have me, myself, and I, like when we're coding our projects, we're judge, jury, and executioner, right? We decide everything. But when you get involved in open source, you are assimilating into an existing project. And so going to the benefits of open source participation, the first is I think open source closely approximates a professional environment, which I think can be very helpful for early career developers. Typically, when we're building our personal projects, it's me, myself, and I, right? You decide what project, what code base, you're making all the decisions. But with open source, you are integrating into an existing project. And I think that requires a different set of skills that should be developed. And I think being able to show off your open source participation on your resume and your online profile can only help your career. Another benefit of open source participation is you learn to consume technical documentation, either the documentation of the project itself or the documentation of the languages or the frameworks that the project uses. Some other benefits are you learn how to communicate effectively in a professional manner. So communicating on technical topics, for example. I think open source participation also allows you to gain experience in tech stacks that are beyond your comfort zone. There's opportunity to belong to thriving ecosystems of tech professionals, which of course is important when you think of networking and growing your career. And ultimately, I think open source participation helps us to make the world a better and more humane place. All right, so how do you identify well-maintained open source projects? Well, I think most well-maintained projects have a detailed code of conduct, right? And so there's a standard of behavior that is expected of everyone involved in that project. And I think this is a sign that they care about how the maintainers and the contributors are treated. I think also organized, well-segmented documentation goes a long way to helping, especially beginning people who are contributing for the first time, to understand what the project is about and feel at home. I think another sign of a healthy open source project is frequent communication. I think maybe at least once or twice a week is a good benchmark, but you definitely want to stay away, in my opinion, from projects where the last comment was several months ago. I think healthy projects also have a robust triage and labeling system. So for example, you might see some issues that are labeled good first issue or beginner friendly. And I think that's a sign that they're thinking about newcomers to the project. In my opinion, projects that have robust test suites, they have quality checks, and they have some kind of continuous integration implemented, I think it shows that the maintainers care about avoiding non-breaking code, right? And also ensuring that the contributors are writing maintainable code as well. Finally, I think if you can find a project that has some kind of community built around the project, and so maybe a Slack group or some other community, I think that also points to a healthier project. So you've identified a project. What do you do? Well, read the documentation at least twice. If they have a code of conduct, you need to understand the behavior expected of you. There may be several prerequisites that you need to go through before you start contributing. You want to make sure you fulfill them all. And I think you also want to read whatever documentation they have around being a contributor. And I think that will help you to understand the conventions they follow and the workflow as well. Now, you don't have to create a pull request to participate in a project initially. You can read through existing pull requests and you can join the communication in these pull requests, or you can, after you set the app up locally, if you discover issues in the app, you can create issues to clue people in that, hey, there's these bugs or there's these problems. And so your first contribution doesn't have to be an actual pull request. Another way to get involved or to start getting involved is to read through some merged pull requests. And so these are pull requests that have been merged into the code base, and you can read through them to kind of see, okay, what have other contributors been working on and kind of what is the workflow expected. Now, talking about your first few pull requests, I want to cover some tips. Go for low-hanging fruit. And in my opinion, the lowest hanging fruit is to update the project's documentation. So in healthy projects, documentation is a living document. It's not like you do it once and you're done. And so while you're setting up the open source project locally, keep track of whatever errors or even unexpected things that you encounter and keep those notes. And then when you're done, your first pull request can be to update the installation documentation with your experience or how you happen to solve the errors you came across. And I can tell you from experience that a lot of project maintainers love these kinds of PRs because it makes their documentation more robust. You also want to look for beginner-friendly issues, like I mentioned before. They may be tagged beginner friendly, good first issue, or newcomers, and you want to target those. You also want to choose whatever issues you choose to work on initially, make sure that they're small in scale because you're still learning the code base, you're learning the processes and workflows. And so when you have a localized change that you're implementing, I think it helps with not becoming overwhelmed in the beginning. And finally, my last tip is to commit to seeing your pull request through. I think one of the things that frustrates open source project maintainers are ghosted pull requests. You cut the pull request and then you're gone. And so try not to ghost your PR. And if you need help or you need to ask questions, be bold in asking your questions. I think part of the ethos of open source is expecting that people will want to contribute that may not understand fully or may not have all the skills. And so for the most part, project maintainers are open to questions, so ask away. Now, I do want to talk about asking questions because that's one of the most common things that you'll probably be doing as you get involved in open source. And I think that there's a way to ask your questions that empower the hearers to help you better. And so when you ask your question, provide all related information in your question so that people who are answering you don't have to fish for this information. And you can use links, you can use images, and you can even use video to describe and contextualize your question. So I'm going to go through a not so effective example, and then I'll cover a more effective example. So this is a less effective approach of asking a question. I get errors while trying to set my local environment up. Please help me. There's nothing wrong with this question, but I think it can be more detailed and you can empower the people who are going to help you more. And so to me, this is a better approach. Whenever I start my app locally, I get the error, port 9200 connection refused, and the app does not run. I have entered all necessary API keys and my fork is up to date with the main repository. Any thoughts and suggestions? Welcome, thanks. So what makes this question more effective, in my opinion, is you are contextualizing what your errors are, and you're already letting them know what you've done and the steps that you've taken to solve the error. But of course, the error still persists. And so this is giving enough context for people to be able to answer you and give you a more targeted answer, as opposed to entering a back and forth fishing for more information. So in summary, I think open source participation can definitely help jumpstart or enrich your career as a software developer. And I think it supports the work that So in summary, I think open source participation can help either jumpstart or enrich your career in tech. And I think the work we do in open source participation supports useful work and useful organizations. You need to take the time to identify healthier open source projects, and in order to save headaches down the line or save you frustration and ensure a smoother open source experience. Lastly, you want to start small, you want to be receptive to feedback, and you want to ask questions effectively and commit to seeing whatever work you embark on through to the end. Thank you for listening.